Hello, hi everyone. Whether you're able to tune in live, I don't know if I'm, sorry. Okay, whether you're able to tune in live or watching this recording, I hope you're having a fabulous day. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Allison, and I have been coaching with Summit Health for a couple of months now. And the topic that I'm going to chat with you about today is all about dietary fats, really what they are and why we need them as part of a healthy, balanced diet. So I chose this topic because, as you may know, fats are a major macronutrient and our bodies need them to function properly. And they're often one of the most confusing and conflicting information around fats in the media and also in science as well. There's just so much information out there. And there's a lot of trends around fat. So you may remember in like the 80s and 90s, fats got a really bad rap. And the low fat food replacements and marketing trends were really popular. But then nowadays, we see the recent popularity of the keto diet, and that's composed mostly of eating fats. So it can get really confusing when we're talking about dietary fats. There are also a few different types of dietary fats, so I'm going to get into that as well. And generally, my goal with this presentation is just to help you gain a better understanding of fats in general, and help you learn a little bit more about what they are and how they're going to support you and your health on a daily basis. So getting into fats at a foundational level, the simplest unit of fat is called a fatty acid. And all the fats in our body and in the foods that we eat are built from these fatty acids. So they form triglycerides, cholesterol, and all of these different structures. And the chemical structure will actually determine what job and what role each of these fat molecules play and do, like the role that they play in our bodies. So when you think of a food nutrition label, we often see total fat, but there's also typically a breakdown between saturated fat and unsaturated fats, and sometimes even an additional breakdown of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. So a lot of terms when we're talking dietary fat. And just to kind of go over this briefly, when we talk about saturation, we're referring to a hydrogen atoms and the hydrogen atoms that are bonded to a hydrocarbon chain. And ultimately, the more hydrogens that are bonded, the more saturated a fat is going to be. And I don't want to get too much into the chemistry behind all of this, but one way that's easier to think about this is thinking about a parking lot as an example. So if we have a parking lot that is completely full and all the spaces are taken, that would be considered saturated. Whereas on the other hand, if we have another parking lot with a few spaces that are empty, that would be considered unsaturated. So that kind of helps put that into perspective just a little bit easier. So again, I'm not going to go too much into the chemistry, but I do think that understanding a few properties of the chemical structure of fats can be really helpful to identify what fats may be present in the foods that we consume on a daily basis. So saturated fats are going to have a more stable and straight structure by nature, and that means that they can pack more tightly together, and this leads them to be solid at room temperature. So thinking about this, butter, coconut oil, a piece of steak with some fat in there, or a piece of chicken with some fat on top, fat on it, those are going to be solid at room temperature. Whereas saturated fats are going to have a more kink shape in their chemical structure, and so that's because they're missing those hydrogen bonds that we talked about, and they can't pack as tightly together. And so therefore they're going to remain liquid at room temperature. So here you can think of cooking oil, so olive oil, avocado oil, and oils like that. And so really the most of the dietary sources of the dietary fat are going to be a combination of both saturated and unsaturated fat. And we need a healthy balance of both of these on a daily basis. And so really the best way to obtain an ideal balance is to consume diverse whole food sources of all different foods. And this can include nuts, seeds, avocado, eggs, fatty fish, different various meats, olive oil, coconut, all great sources of healthy fats that are whole food sources. And just kind of a general rule of thumb, not always the case, but in general, animal sources tend to have more saturated fat, whereas plant-based sources are going to have more unsaturated fats. And so we've kind of talked about that we need fats for a balanced, healthy diet. And we need, this mix of saturated and unsaturated fats, and we have a better idea of how we can identify them. So the next big question is, why do we need them? And so dietary fats have 6 major roles in our body. Just like carbohydrates and protein, they provide us as a source of energy. But fat is the most energy-dense macronutrient. So you get 9 calories per gram of fat versus protein and carbs that have 4 calories per gram of fat. So in nature, fat is more energy-dense. Fats help us make and balance our hormones, particularly our steroid hormones, which include sex hormones, and hormones that are responsible for blood sugar regulation and the regulation of minerals and our fluid levels as well. So super important stuff there. And also eating dietary fats helps release satiety hormones, which can help us feel more satisfied at mealtime. And actually, in fact, consuming too little fat at mealtime can often, hamper satiety because those satiety hormones are not being stimulated, and that can result in eating more overall in a sitting. Fats also form our cell membranes. They also form our brain and nervous system, so very important stuff there as well. And they help transport fat-soluble vitamins, so those vitamins are A, D, E, and K, all which perform really important roles within our bodies as well. And lastly, dietary fat provides us with 2 fatty acids that we cannot produce on our own. This is something that we could dig a little bit deeper in, but I'm going to keep it simple for now. But just for reference, those 2 fatty acids are linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid, and linolenic acid, which is an omega-3. So both very important for us to consume because our bodies cannot produce them on our own. So what's clear here is that fats are super important to our daily function and to our health overall. So then kind of brings up the question of why has dietary fat got such a bad rap over the years? And what it really comes down to is that a high intake of saturated fat has often been associated with increased risk of heart disease. And this is mainly because foods high in saturated fat are also high in cholesterol. And the higher the cholesterol level is in our bodies, that can lead to artery blockage over time. But in reality, our liver actually makes most of the cholesterol in our bodies. And cholesterol is really important for so many things. It has several roles in the body, but it also is important to the creation of many hormones within our bodies as well. And so what it comes down to and what we've learned is different saturated fats have different health effects. And whether you're consuming whole or processed foods is going to make a huge difference here. So processed foods also they often are going to contain saturated fats, but they're also going to be high in sodium and in sugar. And so that sodium and sugar makes the foods more palatable. And it's this combination of different ingredients that is ultimately associated with the increased risk of cardiovascular disease, It's associated with excess body fat and chronic disease as well. And so what we kind of saw in this 80s and 90s low-fat trend is that it was presented as, kind of public health enemy. And there was this creation of so many different low-fat, non-fat processed products. And when the fat was taken out, a lot of the flavor of these products was also taken out. And so to replace that flavor and the kind of bring up the palatability of these foods, sugar and salt and sodium were also added, creating this really, processed, focused foods that were replacing whole, healthy sources of fats. So what we've learned from this kind of low-fat movement is that the higher consumption, there was an overall higher consumption of processed foods, and generally less satisfaction at mealtime, which led to overconsumption and eating more in general, because the satiety hormones were not kicking in as well because the fat was so much lower. There was an increased consumption of sugar and sodium and other just chemically made products and industrial products that were used to simulate the naturally occurring fats in those whole foods. So it kind of took away from, it replaced, naturally occurring fats with this more synthetic stuff. And there was this really hyper focus on one single nutrient rather than, over a well-balanced diet and looking kind of at it as a big picture. And so it was also during this time that trans fats became, engineered, which is this chemically engineered fat, and they were largely used in these processed foods. And over time, eventually, they were deemed unsafe for consumption. And so, what we kind of learn here is that whole foods is really the way to go, and to, be mindful when consuming processed foods. So just kind of wrapping things up with some big takeaways here, is that fats play a really essential role for so many functions in our bodies on a daily basis. They're really important for satiety at mealtime and can help avoid overconsumption. So we want to make sure we have a good amount of fat in our meals to help us feel full and satisfied. The best approach to consuming dietary fat is to aim for a well-balanced diet that includes a variety of foods, different macronutrients, and really has a whole food focus. And, when talking about those whole food sources, you're going to, get that great variety of both saturated and unsaturated fats. And, talking kind of plant and animal sources, just kind of when you're making your shopping list, some different ideas here. Plant sources are going to be avocado oil, fresh coconut or coconut oil, nuts, seeds. There's so many different kinds. They're great for, great in smoothies, salads, oatmeal. You can add them pretty easily to some different dishes. Olives or extra virgin olive oil, even cacao or some dark chocolate is a good source of healthy fats. And then when talking animal sources, butter, cream, eggs, mainly the yolks in there, but whole eggs are going to be a good source of healthy fats. Beef, pork, chicken, different various kinds of fish, or dairy. And when we're talking, animal sources, the fat quality can differ. And we want to, when possible, go towards grass-fed or pastured compared to more conventional farming. And then when talking seafood, wild-caught is going to be a better fat source than farm-raised for seafood. But, that also depends on what's available for you in your area. And you're still going to get great benefits from eating a variety of these whole foods. So thanks so much for listening. If there's any questions, feel free to comment and I will answer. And I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day. Bye, everyone.